What is up, conscious monkeys? Welcome to another episode of Traveling to Consciousness. I am your host, Clayton. Today's guest is an international spiritual teacher renowned for her clarity in using the Akashic Records. She has received titles of the Psychic and the Healer's Healer. These titles come from training many spiritual teachers, coaches, wellness practitioners, and esteemed figures in the fields of spirituality and self-development. She also travels internationally to share her practice, hosting retreats and doing speaking engagements. So guys, we got the spirituality and traveling all in this one thing just for you. Conscious monkeys, welcome to the show, Daniela Gil. Daniela, thanks for being here.
Woo-hoo. I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Clayton.
Well, I'm happy to have you here. So I think a beautiful place to start any conversation is to ask you about where it all began. So when you were a kid, what was your opinion of the Akashic Records? And well, let's not start there. Let's start off with what did you want to be when you first grew up?
A psychologist.
Psychologist.
Yeah. I always knew I wanted to support people. What?
Oh, you started answering the question. I was like, what drove you to do that?
Oh, yeah. I always knew I wanted to support people and work with the mind, work with the spirit, work with healing.
And so that was just a natural call to you?
Yeah.
Was that something that you saw when you were a kid, or did your parents how did you see that was an avenue of a way to go in life?
I don't remember it. I didn't see it from my parents. I don't know.
It was just something that came to you.
Yeah.
Well, so then what, at this point in time when you were just a little kid and you're like, I want to get into psychology, was there any discussion at home about spirituality, about the Akashic Records, about higher dimensions?
Not at all. I actually had, my dad makes jokes. My dad used to work all day and he would come home sometimes he would come home right before I went to bed. And I loved my dad so much. We had an amazing relationship and we would have this really sweet, special time together where my dad would put me to bed. He would maybe read me a story and then he would rub my back or play with my hair until I fell asleep when I was a really little girl. And during that time we would talk. And my dad jokes that those times with me often were torture for him because I would start asking questions like, well, if God made us, then who made God? I don't understand how, what do you mean? Jesus died for us. What do you mean? What does that mean? And how did Jesus this? And how did Jesus that? And God this and God that? And so many questions about spirituality. He said he would at times drive him mad, all these existential questions that I had that he couldn't answer. And I would be so insistent at just seeking the answers. So I always had that in me. And my parents were Catholic. So I went to we called it CCD. It was an after school program to learn about Catholicism. And I would ask a lot of questions there too, to the point where I would frustrate my teachers and get in trouble. And I really didn't get it. And I remember when I was 5 years old, practicing talking to God and sometimes hearing God talking to me, but sometimes not hearing God and being like, where are you, God? And sometimes feeling so close to God and other times feeling far from God. And I also had a really beautiful relationship with nature, with the trees, with the dirt, the sky, the wind, all of it. And feeling God and all of that. And I remember having some really beautiful spiritual moments. One time when I was 7, I was in the shower. And I still remember this moment because it was so profound. I was flooded with this remembering of, I remember we are all one. It was this remembering that I was everything, that I was every river, every stream, every star, every galaxy, all people, that we were all united as one. And for whatever reason, that moment was so memorable for me, really profound.
I'm gonna say that's a profound moment for anybody in life. And that's crazy that you experienced that at the age of 7.
Yeah. Yeah, it came out of nowhere. I was just in the shower.
I was just doing my own thing, and the universe was like, "Hey, you're everything, by the way." Seems like a lot to drop on a 7-year-old.
That's great.
You were ready for it, I guess.
I was curious.
Well, it sounds like it, and that brings me to my next question, which is wow, just lost my words. Was gonna go back to with the teachers in the Catholic school, with how they kind of weren't ready for all the questions that you had. Was it like, what did you kind of make of that? Was it that they didn't really question their own religion? Did it seem like they were, I guess I don't really want to lead you with this, but like, did they kind of like, were they blind to what you were asking? Does it kind of make sense where I'm going with this?
It does. I felt like the responses were somewhat, I didn't feel like people really dropped into my questions and answered them. I felt like they were given perhaps a response, like a textbook response, like something they'd heard or read that wasn't directly answering my question. And it was a response that felt to me like an adult telling me, like, this is it, just accept it, stop questioning it. Meanwhile, to me, I was like, this doesn't make sense. And I want something that makes sense. That was how I felt.
When you say doesn't make sense, was it kind of like they were just giving you a piece of the puzzle as an answer, or was it kind of more of like, okay, I see the truth in that and there's more to it? Or like when you say it doesn't make sense, is it because you saw a bigger picture, or was it more because the actual answers weren't resonating with you?
I don't remember because I was so young, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. So I couldn't tell you exactly what was happening. It's just a general, like, vague memory that I have of this isn't really landing with me.
Gotcha. And so then let's combine the two, right? So when you get flooded at 7 years old with this information, flooded, you were in the shower. Love that pun. Um, when you're flooded with this download that you are everything, and you're also in this environment with like the Catholic school, were you able to kind of find the parallels and see the answers to the questions that you were asking, like through the Catholic lens?
Sometimes when I access my memories, it feels like I'm just making things up. Like I could give you an answer to
Okay.
that, but I'm not actually sure what my childhood experience was like.
Well, then what about you now looking back on it?
My father is extremely Catholic, and now when I have conversations with my father, I feel like I can really understand all of his perspectives, everything that he believes, everything that he holds near and dear. His relationship to God makes a lot of sense to me now. I feel like I really get it. But I also feel like my father has gone really deep into Catholicism since then. And he is embodying it so beautifully. He's really integrated it and he's living it, striving to be like Christ. He has a very deep personal relationship with Christ. And while I personally have a very different perspective, his perspective feels very valid and true and real to me. And I love learning from him now.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so then, not really sure how to answer that word that. So then does it, the way I see it, and guess maybe I'm imposing a little bit of my own perspective on this question, but do you feel like that, the way that he sees it would almost be a sliver of truth that is a part of your overall perspective?
Absolutely, because I feel like my perspective now is far more expansive. So it encompasses many other perspectives, and I'm able to see at this time, now that I've matured more, I'm an adult, and I've been exploring spirituality for years, how there's so much validity and truth to all perspectives, every single one of them.
And this is something that we've talked about before, is the idea of like, and you, I think, have coined this term, the Akashic perspective. How does that kind of play into this idea of perspective? Is like, how do you view the Akashic perspective with regards to this perspective?
I perceive, to me, Akashic perspective is essentially a higher perspective. It's a perspective that is more resonant with that of the Akashic Records. And the Akashic Records are the subtle energetic imprint of everything that has ever happened, everything that is happening, and everything that could happen. So the Akashic Records are the culmination of all perspectives. And Akashic perspective is elevating, expanding our perspective to encompass more perspective. So we're getting closer to the perspective of the Akashic Records. And in that state, there's no right or wrong or good or bad. There's an honoring of the perspective of all beings.
It's
So
kind
then
of
we
this
can,
feeling. Go ahead.
yeah, we can see the truth and validity within everyone's experience, within everyone's beliefs, even if our personal ego doesn't agree with them. But it's not about agreeing with them. We can still have individuation and have peace with the contrast here, with the contradiction, with the duality of the nature of life, knowing that it's an inherent and perfect part of it all, and that one perspective or belief doesn't invalidate another.
And this is reminding me something that's kind of coming up in my life that I've actually been talking about. Maybe it came up actually last night, and I had another conversation this morning about it, where, let me see here. It's the idea that ideas have people, not that people have ideas. So you're smiling. So from a Akashic perspective, I guess maybe the monkey brain that we have, it has a tendency to make these things appear linear, right? So if I were to extract this out, I would say that, we're here on the third dimensional plane, let's say, and then above us would be ideas, let's say, because assuming I get that ideas of people don't have ideas is can be a difficult conversation for people, but you smiled, so I think you're on board. So then would ideas be a layer above people, and then above ideas would be the Akashic perspective?
I suppose I've never thought about it like that.
It's a new way.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like it all just is. And we could speculate that it is like that or no.
Right. And so I guess maybe to give you a little bit more context, or maybe the listener some more context, right? It's, if you look at the history of humanity and the history of the wars even that we've kind of engaged in, it usually stems with religion or politics, right? It's beat the commies, or, it's this fight between fascism, communism, if capitalism, socialism. And then, that might be a political perspective. And then another one would be from a religious perspective with, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and I'm sure there's plenty of other religions, right? And we're willing to kill people out of the ideas that our ideas correct. And I don't know where I was going with that. I guess what would the Akashic perspective have to say about that? Just that it all is?
Well, Akashic perspective is so expansive and it's encompassing an infinite number of perspectives. So anytime we access Akashic perspective, we're tuning into one of those infinite number of perspectives, the one that would be most relevant, empowering, and healing for the person before us to receive, and then speaking to that. So it's not that Akashic perspective has any one perspective on anything. It has always an infinite number of perspectives. When we personally come into Akashic perspective, we release our resistance to and judgment of any one perspective because we can see the validity of it. We can see the truth inherent of it. And oftentimes Akashic perspective offers us a perspective that helps us anchor in love and trust and forgiveness And this is paramount to creating any sort of change in the world, because presently many people are wanting to change things from a place of resisting what is, judging what is, fighting what is. And Newton's third law of physics teaches us that anything that we push up against, like if you push up against a wall, it's going to push back with equal force. And that's why what you resist, what you push, what you fight persists, because we're inadvertently energizing it. So the foundation for change is acceptance. It's trusting what is so that we may receive the gifts inherent within what is, because everything that is exists to serve. It exists for a reason. Everything. And when we are open to it and accepting of it, we can receive the gift inherent within it and work with the energy of it instead of against it, co-create with it. And that's how we change it. It feels like a paradox. What we want to change, we have to first accept. And accepting it doesn't mean I'm never going to work to change this. It's a different way of relating to it so that we can work with it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And it's interesting because it feels like that the universe works when you get to especially an Akashic perspective, that the universe kind of works in a paradoxical way at like the highest forms of things. And you see it through everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, which is why accessing Akashic Perspective is so valuable, because it restores to us our power to create. It reminds us of the impact that we do have on reality, on life, versus trying to fight it or mistrusting it, creating unnecessary suffering for ourselves through perceiving it through a very limited lens. So Akashic Perspective is consistently reminding me that when I want to create change, it's like in relationship. When we want to change something in relationship, we can't fight it or judge it or criticize it. It's more that we become the embodiment of what it is we wish to receive or experience in relationship. And we lead more by example from a space of unconditional love and unconditional acceptance. And that is the ultimate healing, inspiring catalyst for those that we're in relationship with, versus fighting them, judging them, telling them they're wrong. Ultimately, when people are relating in dysfunctional ways, it comes from their own wounding, from their own trauma. And their wounding, their trauma needs to be held in this sacred love and safety and innocence. And it can't be when we're fighting it, when we're judging it, when we're telling them they're bad for it. We inevitably keep that pattern that stems from wounding alive within them. But there's a way in which we can offer a reflection that is clear. And that...
Yeah, and I want to put because I understand what you're saying, but it feels very high level even for me. So I want to inject like a personal example. It's well, maybe not a personal example, but maybe an example that people can relate to. I feel like it gets embodied with the idea of lying, where sometimes you might not want to tell people the truth in order for them to not feel like shame or guilt or fear, right? And sometimes we'll almost subvert the truth. We'll resist the truth in exchange for lying, because we believe that it's better for them to lie to them in order for them to feel safe and comfortable. And it's almost like absolving ourselves of our own innocence. We're kind of feeding that suffering by trying to avoid suffering. Does that resonate with you? Am I on the same page of what you're talking about? Or did I take it a different direction?
Let me feel into that. Yeah, I suppose from Akashic perspective, there's really nothing inherently wrong with being told the truth in a way that would bring up pain for us. It's all emotions are seen as valid and serving in their own way. And being in a space of pleasure is not seen as preferable to being in pain, because pain has its own teachings as well.
Sometimes
And
more
also,
teaching.
yeah. And ultimately, we also cannot have in this experience of duality pleasure without pain. Just like we can't have the experience of hot without cold. We cannot delight in the yumminess of a hot tub without also having the contrast, the other side of cold. They give rise to each other. We cannot know what joy is without also having something called sadness.
Which is what comes into the polarity of just life, right? It's like you can't have good without bad. You can't have masculine without feminine. And it seems like that's something that's just built into this experience of, and maybe it could lead to overanalyzing at times, at least for my logical brain. It's like, oh, have I been too feminine lately, or have I been too masculine? And so you try to right the pendulum to sit in the middle. But even saying that, it feels like it comes across as this resistance that we were just talking about of, oh, well, I can't go too feminine or else, blah, 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 or I can't go too masculine. Like the pendulum's going to find its center. And it sounds like, and what I'm picking up is that accepting everything as it is kind of just puts that pendulum in the center because the universe is always correcting.
I think the acceptance allows us to swing on that pendulum without judging or fearing the experience, and knowing that ultimately everything finds balance eventually. Trusting the
I see.
seasons, trusting the flow without anything
Trusting the
to,
direction.
yeah, without needing it to be any one way. Letting go of the ideas that the mind has around who or how we should be, that we should always be in balance, that we should always be like this or like that, and instead allowing us to simply experience what is naturally arising and be okay with it, letting go of the idea of problematizing it, needing to correct something, needing to be more or better than we already are. It's fascinating. It's like the mind has a fear. If I'm not continuously striving to improve, then I'll stay like this forever. But when we stop striving to improve, when we perceive ourselves through the lens of, I accept you, I love you, you are perfect as you are, that's the ultimate foundation for accelerated growth, for change. Because then we're changing from a place of I love you and accept you versus like, you need to change because you're not good enough as you are, because I'm judging you, criticizing you, rejecting you as you are right now, or criticizing, rejecting this one aspect of you, this pattern, this habit, whatever it may be, this circumstance. That actually doesn't work.
That's something I certainly hit a chord with me, because I certainly have this aspect of always need to be doing, right? Always need to be going, always need to be, like resting. Like if I meditate, or I can meditate, but if like I'm talking to my internal guide and it's telling me to rest, I'm like, nah, I'm hearing you wrong. Like that's not, that's not it. There's a miscommunication here. And it's interesting too, because this kind of ties into the idea of hustle culture, which I've been trying to play with myself, where, which I would consider the concept of always need to be going, always need to be doing, always need to be pushing. But it's almost, and what you illustrated is that if you let go of that and just come into this frequency of love, it'll almost absolve. I don't want to say absolve, but it'll get you there faster than having this ideal pursuit of always doing.
Sometimes I feel that the always doing is where, okay, for me personally, when I'm always doing, it's like I'm wanting to feel a certain way, whether it is accomplish because that's going to bring me peace, that's going to bring me fulfillment. Then I will love myself. Then I will be able to celebrate myself. Or I'm wanting to realize all of my potential, or I'm wanting to feel good enough. There's always something that I'm seeking when I'm pushing, when I'm in that hustling mode. Yet when I relax into myself and allow myself to rest and begin to cultivate this feeling of all is well, I find that I'm naturally inspired and moved into creativity and into action that is perhaps a bit more effortless and easeful and ends up being more productive. And then naturally moved into states of rest, which feel more rejuvenative, which keep me in this state of flow. And then things are created and done, not from a place of this needs to get done, like this, like almost like a tension or a stress in my body, but the pleasure, the joy, the delight of doing, of being alive, of having this energy, this opportunity, this creative force to do things with.
And it's a beautiful way to put it. And the phrase that's coming to mind is inspired action. I feel like I've heard the word inspired action, and it's really resonated with me to understand when I should be, let's say, doing things for the podcast where, if I want to set up a membership or set up a certain program, or like I'm working on like a meditation challenge, these things. And it's like, well, I want to get these done. Right. But if I'm not being inspired, if I'm not embodying, let's say, inspired action to create these things, then I might not be putting out the best product possible for the people that I want to receive it.
Yeah, the energy with which we create something, that's the energy we're putting into it. And then inevitably, that's the energy that is shared through it and transmitted through it, whatever it is that we're creating, whether we're baking something or creating meditation, a podcast. And there's already enough of the energy of, I need to be doing this, I should be doing this.
And I think that's really fascinating because it comes back kind of to the Akashic Records. And you said a phrase that I had never thought of it this way, but you said the subtle energetic imprint. I believe that's what you said. The subtle energetic imprint that every action occurs, right? So with that being said, as we're even co-creating this podcast episode, there's a subtle energetic imprint that each of us are bringing to this recording that's being physically imprinted into the sound waves of the audio file that is then going to get dispersed out to everybody that's listening. So, and this is kind of what is coming from what we were just talking about with like these courses, or even if you're writing a book, it's like, if you're putting in that imprint of, I need to get this done, or, a resistance to what is. Like if I start thinking like, oh, this, like in the middle of our podcast, like, oh, this is a bad podcast, blah, 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 blah. Now my actions are going to put into a different vibrational imprint than, well, it is what it is, which might be the highest imprint that we can put into what we're creating.
Yeah, totally. I feel like once we judge something or come to a conclusion about it, then we inevitably will relate to it according to that conclusion. When we make conclusions about people, we relate to them differently. But when we remain open to possibility, then we can relate to things in a way that impacts them in the way that we desire. Like, it's really interesting. If you have a negative conclusion around someone and you treat them that way, then you're going to bring out that aspect of you. If you treat them poorly, if you treat them from a place of, I don't trust you, it's going to bring out that way of being from them. But if you treat people as if they were just absolutely incredible, you often find that that projection is mirrored back and it's coming from us. And the way that we relate to things, whether it's the podcast that we're recording, our creative project, or other people, impacts how that very thing relates to us and how it shows up for us and what is co-created between us. Because ultimately our experience of people is not who they are. It's a co-creation between us and that person.
Right. Which
Same with podcasts, same with, yeah.
Yeah. And let me see here. You were saying it's a co-creation. And this is kind of coming to something I've been thinking about lately, right? Where there's this level of, if I believe something, everything's possible, right? From my personal perspective, everything's possible. Yet it seems like there's a constraint of the collective conscious of humanity at a whole, where, there's, and maybe this is a limiting belief on my behalf, but there's this bounded nature, and I'm not sure why I'm going down this rabbit hole. Maybe it was just what was called to me, but it feels like there's, I truly believe like that anything's possible from my personal standpoint, right? But then it feels like that there's this boundedness on the collective consciousness of everybody else on planet Earth, maybe throughout the universe. I'm not sure where I really sit on that. But does that maybe, how does that resonate with you? This idea that our perception is only bounded by the collective consciousness at a whole, which could then feed the idea of why we're here to serve, so that we can expand our awareness as a collective, such that we're able to raise our awareness and enable the individual to do even more than once was thought possible.
That totally resonates, because it is, from one perspective, true that anything's possible. And yet we are creating in a world that has other people and other influences and impact from others. And really, everything is not possible for us until everybody is embodying this truth of believing this truth that everything is possible. Because what we believe, we inevitably project onto reality, and it becomes true for us. So if we're in a relationship with someone and we believe anything is possible, but that other person doesn't, we're limited by that.
That's a good way to put it, because I've also kind of seen this in my own world, where it's like, well, maybe I should just, how do you describe this? Like, we're influenced, our energetic frequency is influenced by the people that we associate with, whether it's friends, family, whoever you spend your time with. And a big piece of me has been thinking lately, well, just rid yourself of all the negativity, right? Rid yourself of people that are holding you back, let's say. Well, nobody sees the world exactly how you do. So theoretically, you should just kind of go live in the woods and not talk to anybody. But if you do that, you're not helping anybody. You're not really helping yourself. And it's really not optimal, because we are social creatures. We are biologically somehow designed to interact and to connect with people. So to take such an extreme, and that's like maybe an extreme approach with the pendulum swing of just isolating and leaving all the negativity behind, it's like, well, that's not healthy. But you also can't find yourself in a situation where you're surrounded by people who don't want the best for you.
Yeah, it's, I feel like I know exactly what you're talking about. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on our power to transmute, because I find that even in the healthiest relationships, people are going to bring things to us. Like, I'm thinking of a relationship in my life where someone brings to me so much love and so much peace, unconditional love. And this person happens to also have very limiting beliefs around abundance and prosperity and money. And so it's like people can bring good things to our lives, but also things that we then have to transmute. And I've been playing around with the idea of honoring that I'm impacted by everyone in my life, and also honoring my capacity to transmute whatever is projected onto my field, whatever I take in from others, transmute it and choose my way. And in a sense, honor myself as both so interconnected with all of life, with everyone around me. I'm one with them. And paradoxically, I'm also a sovereign being. So in some moments when I feel like I'm being negatively impacted by someone, maybe they're not wishing the best for me, and I can feel how that is affecting me, taking that moment to, okay, I'm claiming my sovereignty now. I have compassion for where this person is coming from. I forgive them. When you have compassion and forgive, you're not as tied into the energies that are being projected onto you. And then you can work with them. You can relate to them in a way that is empowering, that is healing, and in a sense, honor their experience, where they're coming from. It's okay. And I'm choosing to have my own.
It's a great way to put it.
It's like a way to have healthy boundaries. And sometimes it's just really not relevant to have people in our lives when they are operating from a certain place, because I feel like we all have gifts to share. And sometimes when we're sharing these gifts and they're just not received by this person, and we're not really receiving their gifts, and we're triggering each other's woundedness and traumas and cycling in that, maybe that's not the relationship that is going to bring us towards healing and them towards healing.
And that kind of, you go ahead. You had more?
Oh, no.
We got a little delay here. So working on manifesting a studio so I can like afford to just fly people out. So
nice.
Yeah, we'll get there. In a couple episodes, we'll bring you back on and have an in-person session. But until then, you were bringing up, lost my train of thought a bit. We were talking about
how people impact us.
How people impact us.
Sovereignty,
right? Because
ability to transmute.
Right. So maybe we'll go with the ability to transmute, because this is something I thought about recently. I'm big into eating meat myself, and something that people brought up was this idea of, well, you don't want to eat, cows or whatever because of the way that they're raised in certain farms, right? Where there's like factory farming, or where there's just like, they're treated terribly, right? In a place of fear, which gets put into the animal, right? If you're surrounded by that energy, it gets fear, lack, scarcity. If that energy is being placed into any item, whether it's from meat to, I argue you could even find it in vegetables if they are coming from a similar place. You then would take that energy in if you eat that food, no matter how quote unquote good we think that it is for us. And so this comes into how you're talking about transmuting energy. And this was kind of a beautiful thing that I realized with like religion, is where with religion, this idea of grace, where, you would kind of sit there and say a blessing before eating with your family. And I guess that's kind of this element of being able to transmute the fear out of the food that you're about to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. Our consciousness has so much power, and our consciousness ultimately has the most power over, I believe, ourselves. So through our consciousness, our intention, and our prayer, through saying grace, we change our relationship to whatever it is that we're consuming, I feel, and make it more digestible to our systems, make it healthier. It's then infused with whatever energy we put into it. And also, I do believe that it does.
Go ahead.
I also believe that it does require energy. Like when we're eating, for example, meat of an animal that has experienced severe pain or suffering, yes, we can transmute it, and it requires the use of our life force energy to transmute that.
Oh.
Versus eating something that is naturally carrying a higher frequency.
Interesting. So this touches on another thing that I've been thinking about, where, if you tap into love, well, here's the interesting thing. And I I've been talking to some chick on TikTok who does like telekinesis, and which is a whole crazy rabbit hole all in itself. But and for those who don't know, it's basically using your mind to move objects. And what she kind of has pointed out is that you're able to, and I haven't really worked with her or anything, but her whole thing is that you don't want to pull the energy from yourself, because this is how people hurt themselves, is if they pull the energy from themselves in order to connect with the object in order to move it. So like people even in the comments of her videos are like, hey, I've tried this, but like I get nosebleeds or I start to pass out. And her whole thing is like, well, you're taking the energy from yourself and transmuting it into the object. And her thing is to be able to pull the energy from the environment around you to move the object. So where am I going with this? So to relate it back to what we're talking about and this idea of transmuting, is there a way to, would there not be, I guess is maybe the way I'd phrase this, is would there not be a way to pull the energy from the divine source of love and use that as your source of transmutation as opposed to pulling it from your own life force?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And I believe it is a practice. It's something that I actually teach in my training, how to bring forth divine healing energy from source, from that infinite source of energy and of love. And I feel that I've personally never experienced Amma, but I remember someone telling me that they volunteered with Amma and they worked with Amma, the hugging saint. Do you know who she is?
No, I haven't heard of it before.
Okay, so she's this woman who, she has an incredible frequency and she travels, and I don't know if she does speaking engagements, but afterwards, I'm really not familiar with her at all. I just spoke to someone who volunteered with her, and she was telling me that this woman can hug people for hours, all night long. People get in long lines to receive a hug from her because her hugs are so healing and transformative. Her frequency is so powerful, and she doesn't even need to eat. She doesn't need to sleep. She
Whoa.
can just hug person after person after person. So I do feel that we can learn how to master and get better and better at sourcing from this infinite pool. And I also feel that being in this human body inherently has limitations. It's still, moving through our human body, which is somewhat limited. So I feel like it's a kind of like a both and type of thing, not one or the other.
And what this is, first of all, I got to go check out this A-M. Is that how you spell her?
Oh, Amma.
Amma.
Really
A-M-A. The hugging queen.
Amma. A-M-M-A.
A-M-M-A. All right, I'm going to make a note here to check her out. But where it's taking my mind is in sacred texts like the Bible. And even I was in Egypt recently, and they talked about a king who ruled, well, I'm not going to go into the deep details, but essentially he would have ruled, what was it? It was a 30-year trial, or it was a trial they did every 30 years, and he did it 11 times. So he would have lived to be like 300 at least. And there's stories kind of in the Bible where they say people live to be 900 years old. Now, the way we interpret it today is, they're being, embellishing, right? We say that they're embellishing, their age, or we're misinterpreting, or, we rationalize these excuses for it to not physically be this 900-year-old person or this person who lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so to me, this comes to two things. Number one, I try to look at these things as being as truthful as possible, because they wouldn't have really made this up, in my opinion. Of course there's reasons, ego reasons, but let's assume that they didn't. Let's assume that they actually lived to be this age. The two things come to mind is, one is the limitation of our collective consciousness, like what we talked about earlier, limited in believing that we can only live X years, which, as we talked about, nothing's impossible, right? And then the second thing would be is, well, shouldn't there be, does it not make sense that there's a way to take on this divine energy for us to exist for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. Why not? Right?
Yeah, it feels to me like aging is an inevitable part of this experience, but we don't have to age the way we think we have to age as quickly as we age. And I feel like
Well,
we are mortal beings, but that doesn't mean we're limited by, 120 years, which is what we seem to believe now. I feel like there are ways to work with our life force energy, which like many ancient beings knew about, where we could extend our life significantly.
and right. And as you were saying, like aging is a part of this experience, but so is healing. So
Yeah.
why is it that we believe that, and I think this comes down to a collective consciousness program, quote unquote, where, it's like we have on paper, okay, our expected age of life is 70 or 80 years. We have certain anomalies where people live to be 120, like you pointed out. But if we also break down society as a whole, majority of people aren't doing what they love for 40 years. And the general understanding is that after 40 years, now we get to find our passion. Well, you've been trained into this way of thinking that, well, after doing something I hated for 40 years, how are you going to, first of all, it must be so difficult to find what you actually love doing. Not impossible, but just difficult to find what you love doing for those last, quote unquote, 20 years. And even in the way I'm speaking about this, I'm speaking as if it's finite, when, it's just, I'm going to just do what passes the time until, I hit roughly 80. And now the whole social program kicks in that, well, I mentally am going to be, let's say, dying, or I no longer have something to serve, or I've had every experience I need to have, and therefore 90 feels like a good number, so I'm just going to die at that age. Because it kind of comes into now with the placebo effect, in my opinion, where if the collective consciousness believes this idea, then that's what's going to happen.
Mm. Yeah, I've spoken to a spiritual teacher who believes that as the collective consciousness awakens, we are remembering our oneness with Creator, our oneness with Source, and the fact that we are Creator, we are Source. And as we do that, things like aging and all of that is simply going to disappear. And we're going to be living this experience of infinite possibility, so much so that he believes that we're going to be teleporting and being able to go back in time. And even he was telling me, he's like, oh, I'm going to be able to like go back in time and have lunch with my grandma like I used to when I was a little kid. And yeah, so I mean,
Well,
this
because that,
experience is just so expansive. It's not really limited the way we think it is. There's so much more happening here.
and that kind of comes back to our whole limiting belief, right? And this was something that I kind of even started picking at with the idea of, like with romantic relationships. I kind of had this called societal program or whatever. I'm 28 right now, and so my ideology was, I don't want to have kids for another 8 to 10 years. So if I'm going to get into a relationship with someone, they probably need to be in the range of 22 to 24. And, my last girlfriend was 23, and she even asked me like, well, why do I, because I was super honest with her. I was like, yeah, like if I'm going to date someone, I want them to be in this age range. I basically laid that out to her, and it got me thinking of like, well, why do they need to be that age? Like what happens if, what happens as I age, what does their age kind of need to be? And I found it super interesting that I found a part of my limiting belief was around the conception of, women entering, let's say, menopause, or, entering the age where they're no longer able to bear children. And then that came into my forefront, and I was like, well, is that also not just a limiting belief that women aren't able to have kids into their, I don't know, 50s, 60s, arguably 90 years old? Like, if you deconstruct this idea of infinite possibilities, why could a woman not have kids at the age of 80? Because wouldn't that also just be a societal construct that, well, the average woman isn't able to reproduce at the age of, let's say, 40, or they shouldn't, and it kind of gets into this whole medical realm of, where truly lies the limitations, our biological limitations, if we're not able to just pull infinite energy from source consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you're bringing this up because I'm living in Peru right now in the Sacred Valley. And this is not factual at all. It's simply what a moto taxi driver told me actually yesterday. He asked me what my age was and why I hadn't had children yet, and if I was worried about missing the opportunity to have children. And it was like, no, absolutely not. My grandmother actually had her last baby at 50.
Whoa.
And my other grandmother had my mother at around 45. My mom had my sister at around 45. And then he told me, and this is not factual, this is just what he said to me, that the women in the area here go through menopause around 38. I was like, oh, wow. It feels like the human body is, I just feel like it has a wisdom to it. And it knows what it's doing. And maybe for the women around here, they're going through menopause at 38, or that's just what he's personally experienced because they started having kids at, 20, and the body is already done. Like, this is it. Like, Spirit's like, okay, you've had 5 kids now. Like, we're done.
Right.
Like, there's just so much more going on. We're really not limited by other people's experiences. We each have our own consciousness, and we're each a universe unto ourselves. And we tend to believe that because that's how it is biologically for somebody else, and that's how it is biologically, period. Yet our biology is so impacted by our consciousness, by our unconscious beliefs too.
And it even expands out into that fear principle, right? Where, now my interpretation, and this could differ for anybody that's listening, maybe even for yourself, but the way that I've perceived reality is I've been surrounded by information society telling me that, you basically should have your life figured out by the age of 30. You should know what career you want. You should know the girl you're going to marry. You should know everything, which obviously is not the healthiest standard of perceiving reality, because I think that shit just is ever changing. But even more so, it invites this idea of fear, and it's kind of a fear complex, a fear imprint of, well, women, quote unquote, can't have, you shouldn't, I guess it's a medical term where they say you shouldn't, quote unquote, have kids after the age of like 35 because of increased risks, increased this. But so much stuff from the medical community has been proven wrong time and time again. I mean, there's just, you can go down the list. I honestly thought about starting a podcast where you just interview people who have defied, and maybe I need to do this, where it's like people where doctors tell them they have X days to live and they're living 10X days after that. And I know quite a few people where it's like medical doctors tell them they'll never walk again. And then they, the next day they wake up and, or, 5 days later, they're walking again. You're just crazy shit. And that's probably hyperbolic, but just crazy shit like that, where we have these medical things that we deem as medical truths, quote unquote, scientific truths. Yet there's so many edge case situations. Your great grandparents having kids at the age of 45 and 50. And I assume they lived at least, another 20, 30 years after that. So to me, it's like the only true limitation we have is what we're willing to accept as being our truth.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like it's all far more expansive than that. And I don't feel like these medical conclusions are supportive to us really interfacing in life, which is helping us live into these possibilities versus be limited by these like limiting beliefs, by these like constrained by them.
It's fascinating. And it also go ahead.
It's feel like there's also a lot of fear within the collective human consciousness and within the medical industry and within the world at this time that has us not trust our own inherent divinity and the way in which spirit moves through us and the power of that energy of spirit moving through us, the intelligence behind it that is so beyond the comprehension of the human mind.
It's difficult too, because you might have these sparks of divine knowledge coming into your awareness, and you bring them up with people who are around you, who are close to you. And if they don't believe it, then you have a tendency to not believe it because they told you that it doesn't make sense to them. And it's this like inward ability to trust that it's right. Like you need this form of validation. And for instance, and maybe this can kind of bring it back to the Akashic Records, I started working with a girl on Monday, like to help open up, she calls it like opening up your pathway. And, to me, it's like, there's still this level of like distrust. Like I need the validation of if I receive a certain information, like you got to receive it as well and tell me that I'm right. It's not, just, I think that's right. You have this belief, and people will experience this when they ask for a sign, like send me a sign, and the universe gives them that sign. And then they're like, not sure if I believe that sign. Like, give me a sign year one. And then the universe is like, what the fuck, man? Like, I just gave you it. But there's this like inherent distrust. And maybe this comes back to distrusting ourselves, where we're not even able to trust what the universe is telling us or saying to us.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes in the situations when we need trust in order to trust, we're not actually given that thing that we think we need in order to trust because the universe is asking us to just trust. It's like our trust, the universe doesn't want our trust to necessarily be conditional.
That's a hard pill to swallow. But it totally makes sense.
It's like, I will trust you if, and life is like, just trust.
We don't put conditions on trust.
Yeah, if we play the game of I will trust you if, then that will go on forever. But as soon as we open to the trust, then we have trust. And trust is everything. Trust is what gives us faith. Trust is what gives us peace. Trust is what gives us acceptance.
Right.
Allows us to forgive, hold compassion, see people through the eyes of their innocence and their purity instead of blaming and shaming them.
What's coming to me is in, let's say, the manifestation type community where, it's this idea of I'm doing everything right. I set my intentions. I gave it a why, and yet it's not coming true. It's almost like there's a level of that being that you need to trust that it'll come in the divine timing, right? It'll come when you need it to come. The reason
or trust that it doesn't need to come.
Right.
That everything that we actually need, life will always offer us.
And when it's optimal. Right.
Yeah. If it's optimal, and what we perceive as optimal is not necessarily what's optimal. We don't actually need the very thing that we're trying to manifest in order to experience love, joy, peace, in order to realize our potentials. Sometimes these are creations of our ego, of our mind, of I want this, I want that, but it's not actually what the soul wants or needs, what life wants or needs for us. And there's a divine intelligence that knows us better and that knows how to provide for us and serve us better than we do ourselves from the place of our own ego. Of course, there are many aspects of us.
Right. And that's so valid because I'm trying to relate it back to my podcast. And, there's a level of, well, I want, certain people I would deem as dream guests, right? Very well known influencers. I hate that word. We're all influencers. very well-known personalities who would be quote unquote ideal people to bring on this podcast to introduce. And like you're even saying, there's an element of that where I can tell it's ego. It's validating. Like if I could have, let's say I'll name drop where it's like Joe Dispenza, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan. If they came on my podcast, it would be validating, right? It would feed the ego. It would be this little ego poke of, hey, everybody look at me. Look what I was able to pull off. And yet I don't know if I'm coming from that place of ego, it may not produce the best possible podcast for the people who currently listen to my podcast, right? Because I could be in this place of overwhelming excitement where I'm not even asking them the best questions possible. And it could be that, I think you're going to be episode 37. It could be that they're best if they're episode 500 or something, where I will be at that place of confidence in myself. Where was I going with this? Oh, we're talking about like manifestation and like things coming in divine timing, or even as you're pointing out, maybe it's not in my highest good that those people, I ever have a personal conversation with them. And comes down to the trust of, I just need to trust that the universe knows and puts in my alignment who is the best person for me to interview or talk to at any given time.
Absolutely. I had a really challenging relationship for 2 years, incredibly challenging. And there was a lot of self-reflection that I did, asking myself, how did I manifest this? Why am I manifesting this? What I really want is this other relationship that feels like this, that's harmonious, that feels like divine union, that's so beautiful. And after I ended that relationship, I got into this other relationship that feels like everything that I was wanting. It feels like divine union. It's so harmonious. It's so beautiful. And upon reflection, I realized that there's no way I could have co-created this divine union type relationship, appreciated it, received it, shown up for it without all of the experiences I had in that challenging relationship. There's just no way. One of my biggest manifestation goals and dreams of 2021 was I want a beautiful house on Maui. And it just wasn't manifesting. It wasn't happening. I was like, usually I'm like magical in my manifestations. If I want something, it kind of is because it's meant to be and it often happens. But in this one regard, it wasn't happening. And it was not happening in ways that didn't even make sense. Like a realtor would be like, yeah, we love you. Okay, great. And then suddenly, I'm so sorry. The owner changed their mind. It's like, what? And then I ended up traveling to Peru, falling in love. And now I'm applying for my Peruvian residency. So it feels like whenever something has really not worked out the way that I wanted from my mind, from my limited perspective, I could have never foreseen that I would have ended up living in Peru. That's just
wild.
Not in my imagination until it actually manifested. And now that it's happening, it's like, oh, this would have been really challenging if I had a place and a lease on Maui. And never could I have imagined that I would find a sanctuary, a paradise that I would love more than Maui.
Right.
But life knows. Life knows. So sometimes I feel like we create unnecessary suffering for ourselves and we don't trust the experience that we're having or trust whatever it is that life is offering us. If we're all one, then that means life is us. So why would life hurt or harm us at the level of our soul? I think people get really identified
hurting itself, right?
Exactly. Even my challenging relationship that felt so painful at times, it was actually incredibly healing. And it's all in how we relate to it. Well, at times things happened that felt like they could be really traumatic, but I feel like we can relate to those experiences through, and I actually feel like I have to be mindful about what I'm sharing right now. For me personally, things happened that could have left a traumatic type of imprint or had me not trust or just really hurt or harmed me in some way. Yet I felt like I was divinely guided to relate to it from a place of receiving the gifts inherent within it, really knowing my strength, knowing my resilience, connecting with compassion and forgiveness at the same time, learning how to create boundaries, learning how to not receive when people throw pain at us, how to not receive it and instead hold it with love, acceptance, and compassion instead of being like hurt by it. So it was an incredible learning for me that I don't feel I could have experienced any other way, because our intimate relationships, I feel, for me, are the ones that impact me the most. I'm someone who, if someone has road rage and curses me off, it's like my heart rate doesn't even really go up at this point. It's like, oh, okay, they're upset. That's okay. People get angry or triggered. I'm more okay with it now than ever before. But man, those intimate relationships, they touch deep places. So it was the ultimate medicine for me. And there was a way to relate to it where everything, like I had no choice but to receive it as medicine versus poison.
And how do you feel like you got to that place of receiving it as medicine? Was it kind of just letting it flow through you? Or how did you make that shift in your mind that, oh, this is so terrible, this is so awful, to, wait, this is beautiful. This is what I needed to see?
When I would go into places of victimhood or suffering, blame, anytime I went into that, it would create this unbearable suffering within me. My emotions, my mind, my physical state, it did not feel good. And then when I shifted into a more empowered, a more expansive perspective, I always felt better. And then he could behave however it is that he needed to behave. He could play out his traumas. He could project all he wanted. And I could still remain in a peaceful, loving state, which is a state that I want to be in. It is extremely painful for me. It hurts. I hate it when I'm not in that state. But in the relationship, I realized I couldn't make me being in that state dependent upon how he was showing up.
So then there might be a paradoxical answer here as well, where so my last relationship, I'm in between relationships right now. My last relationship, I saw that there were those triggers like you're talking about. And I even saw times where I invoked triggers in her. So where comes that line, right? And I think what I'm approaching here is that line of understanding when to move on versus, oh, this is therapeutic and healing. Because you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the way I'm interpreting this is that you needed to experience these triggers to learn how to hold space and hold compassion for these deep wounds. So at what point does it become, okay, I learned my lesson of learning how to hold the space for this and I need to move on, versus, well, I'm just going to keep holding the space for this negativity?
Yeah, that is a brilliant question. It took me a long time to get there, and a lot of Akashic record readings, as well as some Wachuma ceremonies when I got here in Peru. And I'll speak to my personal experience. It felt like my own Akashic record readings for myself were at first encouraging me to continue learning, to continue receiving. And then after some time, encouraged me to recognize that this was the nature of our dynamic and that I was orienting myself to it as if there were infinite possibility, as if anything were possible. Yet I was doing that from a place of rejecting reality as it was, which is that we were incompatible. We were looping in these cycles of fighting and resisting each other. There were triggers that I was experiencing that felt, over time, they felt like they actually weren't supporting my growth. It felt like, oh, it's just, I don't want or need this. And then I knew it was time to move on once I like really looked at reality as it was. Once I started to experience the triggers as something that simply were not of my preference, they no longer felt like medicine for me anymore. The triggers weren't even as triggering anymore. Like it was kind of just observing, like, oh, this, I actually, I feel dishonored. I don't feel safe here. And I'm not triggered about it. I'm not judging it. I'm not criticizing it. I'm not freaking out. I'm not fighting with him anymore like I had in the past. It was simply, this doesn't feel honoring to me. This doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. And in my current relationship, when I get triggered, it feels very clear to me that it is my own ego, my own projections, my own expectations on who or how someone else should be, my own labels of it's good to be this way, it's bad to be that way. And that's why I get triggered with him. It's not because there is some sort of inherent incompatibility. I feel like my triggers with him guide me towards deeper love and deeper acceptance. And it's very easy to see that my triggers are mine. In my past relationship, it was almost starting to feel like I was getting triggered because I was misaligned. It just felt misaligned. Like I was somewhere where it wasn't my place to be. It wasn't my role. It felt like I had strayed from my dharma versus something touching upon my ego's conditioning, which is what I'm experiencing now when I get triggered. It's like, ooh, there's my ego's conditioning. There's my limitation to love versus like an inner voice that's like, you don't belong here, which is how I felt in the last relationship.
And so then that's a really interesting paradigm where, let's see here. So now the triggering is that it's, your own, let's say conditioned beliefs or ego. Whereas before it would have felt different then. I'm assuming that because to me, so my perspective is that before it would have still just been your ego triggers that you needed to reconcile. But I'm a little bit at a loss for words here. So how would you, maybe this is the question, how would you categorize the holding space? Is that maybe how you would phrase it? Is that in your previous relationship, it was more about learning to hold space for negative energy, whereas now it's just more, oh, this is my own ego / limiting beliefs that I need to reconcile.
Yeah, like my last relationship showed me how when I felt extremely unsafe or attacked, I would go into defending myself, which would be interpreted as an attack back. That's how it would be experienced by him. And that's what I was doing. So I would engage in these fighting energies. And once I learned how to not engage in them, it felt like, oh, I wasn't drawn to the relationship anymore at all. And in my present day relationship, anytime I'm triggered, it's like, I could try to blame him. I could try to judge him. I could try to criticize him, but deep inside, it doesn't feel right. It feels like this is mine. These are my limiting beliefs. This is showing me the limits to my love, the limits to my acceptance. And what I am insisting that I need from him right now, I know at a soul level that I don't actually need. These are my projections. It really feels like it's me versus something that just doesn't feel right for me.
It's relating it back to your house in Malibu. It's that feeling of, it seems like there's a corollary here with your house in Malibu where that may have been coming more from the ego. Where's the correlate? What's the connection here that I want to make? Where it feels like that was a little bit more from the ego versus now, like as that was its own lesson of, seems like you almost had it. Oh, you almost had it again. And then it kind of came to this realization maybe that it wasn't for your highest good, which is then what took you down to Peru. So maybe a question here is, are you still interested in that house in Malibu?
I think there's a part of me that is. It was actually Maui.
or
And
Maui?
yeah, there's a part of me that is, but deep inside it feels like a vision and dream that I created an attachment to. More so that if I really drop into the reality and accept with gratitude what is, here I am surrounded by the mountains of Peru. And that's where I am.
So do you, not really sure where to take that. Let's go back to, let's go, let's go back to, when you were saying that you wanted to be a psychologist, because I guess you're kind of a psychologist now, but maybe a little bit different than what you would have been trained. Did you end up, let's try to get back to the journey of going from a psychologist to being an Akashic record reader. In that journey, in that transformation, what was like the next step? Like, did you want to be a psychologist throughout high school, and did you have plans to go to college for it?
I did. And I went to college for psychology. And I feel like I had such a clear dharmic direction for my life. Like the first time I accessed the Akashic Records, I knew it was my dharma. So I was always led by that. And in college, I loved just studying psychology. I was obsessed with it. And there were parts of it that really didn't feel right. Like I felt like, I know a different way. I'm not going to necessarily do this way just because it was taught to me. Like when I was taught how to diagnose people and all the ways to diagnose people and what it means about them, none of that felt right to me. And I've always had like an internal voice, I feel, guiding me.
Interesting. It's interesting you bring up the idea of there's another way, because that's something that I have been experiencing quite a bit with. I've been seeing this parallel with, I first saw it with jujitsu, where, I'd be taught to do a certain thing, a certain move, a certain way, and then I'd be questioning it, kind of like you would question all these things. And it's like, well, doesn't this way make a bit more sense? Or does that make sense? And sometimes it would hit, sometimes not so much. And then I'm also now seeing the corollary with even this girl that I met with on Monday, who was talking about opening up your pathway to the Akashic Records, where she was taught in a very strict format, like you can only do this at this time of day, or you can only do this after X times of using certain substances, or, you have to get explicit permission in this situation, or, usually there's like a mantra associated with opening it up, and there's like a very explicit way to do it. And now what she's teaching in her practice is now this like she's kind of seeing it as this next evolution of, well, you're able to trust your intuition with changing, this mantra, or, it's more of a do what feels right to you perspective, as opposed to this rigid nature of, you can't do these things and you have to obey kind of these rules in order for it to work. And I'm trying to remember where I was going with that. Oh, the evolution of like psychology, even where, you're experiencing these things that are like, oh, well, this is what it means, or this is what it has to mean. And then you're seeing this new perspective of, oh, I think that could be handled better. Or, oh, I think there's a different way to do that.
Yeah, it felt like my way would be discovered over time. And it wasn't that way. That way just
Interesting.
didn't feel like my way.
Like that it wasn't for you kind of thing.
Yeah. I felt like there was a lot missing too that I really wanted to learn about, that it just didn't feel fully comprehensive. Like I didn't learn a lot about the spiritual aspects or even our nutrition or anything like that, and how it plays a role in our well-being and in our spiritual health and in our mental health.
That's interesting. Would have when you were going through the psychology, were they teaching you anything about nutrition or exercise? Because that plays a huge role in our psychology as well.
It was very minimal. And I remember feeling like, actually, this feels really important to me. And learning about neuroscience and learning about pharmaceuticals didn't resonate with me at all. I had my own journey with pharmaceuticals for depression and anxiety and ADHD, which upon reflection, I absolutely don't believe I have or ever had.
Well, that feels like one of those. That feels like one of those made up symptoms to control people.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, if you can't sit well in
Exactly.
school, let's medicate the consciousness to the brain to conform, kind of thing.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I didn't like school, but I can now that I'm doing what I love, I mean, I can channel for hours. There's definitely no ADHD in there. I can sit and focus for hours. I just didn't want to do what I was told to do.
Well, yeah, what you're being told to do, you don't want to do it. So why sit there and do it? And then this kind of probably invoked your same line of questioning with religion, where you're asking questions that people don't want to take the time to answer or even consider because it's kind of outside of the collective consciousness at the time. And so then let's use our collective consciousness to solve this problem based on our limiting beliefs and call it ADHD and now subscribe medication for it. Shit. That kind of pulled me back. So then you kind of alluded to accessing the Akashic Records. I think you kind of mentioned that it was probably during college, or was it during high school that you would have first experienced this? Or
it was actually way after college.
Way after or right after?
Yeah, many years after college.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, I was going to go get a graduate degree in psychology, and it ended up feeling more like a desire of my mind. It didn't feel totally resonant. So instead I did a yoga teacher training because I felt called to learn more about spirituality and the mind-body spirit connection. And then that evolved into nutritional, like health coaching. I studied nutrition and I became a holistic health coach. Eventually that evolved into becoming a breathwork facilitator. It was a very ceremonial space. It was incredible to do that. And then as I was facilitating breathwork, I discovered the Akashic Records.
Okay. That's pretty cool. And it's interesting you kind of went on that journey, because I felt like my journey was kind of similar, where you kind of start dabbling into these ancient practices that we've kind of westernized, I guess, like yoga, for instance. It seems like it's very westernized from where it originally was. But it seems like you almost start on this journey of like, okay, well, yoga is the most quote unquote socially acceptable form that I'm going to dive into. You start experiencing the benefits of it. And then you're like, wait, what was another thing that I held as being this like taboo practice? And then you start trying these different modalities, and breathwork was one of them for sure. And breathwork's fascinating because you can actually hallucinate. I guess hallucinate's a weird word too, because are you hallucinating or are you actually just perceiving a different version of reality?
Yeah.
So, which is actually, maybe we could, I don't even know. That's an idea that just came to me, is like hallucination is almost, the connotation associated with it is that it's not real. But you could argue that it's just as real as me and you talking right now. And maybe that's a rabbit hole we could jump down, because I've never explored that one before.
I feel like breathwork just takes us into very expanded states, and it takes us into other versions of reality.
Like with that DMT release.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps us gain perspective on our lives. It has definitely taken me to those places of oneness, similar to the places I've touched upon in plant medicine ceremonies, like with ayahuasca. It helps release a lot of emotional buildup. It can open up our hearts. It can open up our minds.
Excuse me. Not sure if the camera picked that up or mic picked that up. Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff how it then kind of like even opens up this wormhole to like what's next. So did you how did you find the Akashic Records through breathwork? Was it something that spoke to you during a breathwork session, or did somebody come into your life who then opened your mind to this idea or this realm of Akasha?
I went to a retreat and one of the facilitators offered a complimentary Akashic record reading afterwards, like a 15-minute reading. And I wasn't interested. I thought it had something to do with maybe my ancestors' records. I wasn't sure, but it didn't feel like something I was interested in. But then a friend from the retreat said she highly recommended the experience. So I booked it and it was amazing. I was like, wow, this was incredible. So it piqued my curiosity. And I found the prayer from Linda Howe. Linda Howe is one of the world leading experts on the Akashic Records. And when I said the prayer, I was immediately flooded with the most powerful, beautiful, divine energy. And my psychic capacity was it was so clear. It felt so potent. It was such an amazing state simply from saying a prayer. And in that moment, I knew, I was like, oh, this is what I'm meant to be doing. This is absolutely it.
That's awesome. So it sounds like a pretty powerful prayer. Do you remember it?
I actually don't, because I pretty much immediately from there channeled my own.
Okay. Is it like available online to find like Linda Howe's
totally.
prayer? Okay.
Pathway. I think she calls it the Pathway Prayer.
Linda Howe Pathway Prayer. I'll have to check that out. That's pretty cool. Damn, I usually don't write. I think that just knocked me out of the flow. I usually don't write. I usually just go back and listen to it later. So I guess that's a learning experience for me right there. Don't write. Just come back to it later. Oh, cool. So you found it, and then this kind of sent you down this like rabbit hole of like, I guess, starting your own business around it, where now you even like offer consultation and I guess you read for people and then also teach people how to access it on their own.
I primarily teach people how to access it on their own. I have a group training and I also offer one-on-one mentorship.
Do you find that that's more fulfilling?
It's the most fulfilling thing I've ever done, and it is absolutely my dharma. Like all that I am, all that I've experienced, it feels like it brought me to this place, and I feel like I have a unique talent around it that is God-given. It's not even something that I needed to create or study for. It simply flows through, and it feels more aligned than anything I've ever done.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I mean,
yeah.
Yeah. And so do you feel like, so through the evolution, I think we kind of touched on this earlier, kind of through this evolution, do you feel like it's something that will evolve into something else down the road?
No.
This is it?
I think that, yeah. I don't know what is. I do believe that through my Akashic channel, I'll be creating courses on things that I've personally experienced and healed through my Akashic channel, like what I spoke about earlier, having really challenging what you might call a toxic or unhealthy relationship, moving into a healthy dynamic, a course on that. Or I also had an eating disorder for over 10 years, so healing a relationship to food. I feel I'll expand in different ways and create different kinds of courses and trainings. But at this time, it's hard to imagine doing anything. It's hard to imagine not training people in how to access the Akashic Records, although who knows what life will bring my way, because I've also been diving deep into working with Wachuma. Although even as I say it out loud, Wachuma, also known as San Pedro.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it just feels so good and so right for all that I am for now.
So here's an interesting idea that I was kind of only recently brought up to, is like the Akashic realm is like only one plane of existence, right? Like we're operating in the physical realm of existence, the taste, touch, smell, sight, taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. Like that's all in this physical realm of existence. And then what we're kind of talking about, the Akashic realm, is of the Akashic realm of existence. With your pathway, have you ever kind of dove into the other realms of existence, like the astral, the mental? Because these were realms, first of all, that I wasn't really even aware of until recently. And I was like, oh shit, like there's a lot more here than I was even aware of. First of all, I guess what's your take on those other realms? And then like, have you kind of played with those yourself?
It just cut out at the end. Can you say it again?
Oh, sure. I was just saying, like, what is your perspective on those realms? Because I'm very, very novice, very beginner of it. And then, based on your perspective, have you actually went into any of these realms and done any work, or I don't really know what there is to do there, played around with these realms yourself?
When I come into Akashic Perspective, I'm brought into various different realms according to what is relevant, yet I don't label them as anything. They don't necessarily have a name.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not working so much with those labels of where I am.
Okay. Gotcha.
It's very much a channeled state, and a state that is so beyond the mind. Not much is thought about or tried to make sense of or understood. It's like a magical healing place where we're accessing the Akashic realm, which is ultimately it feels like one of infinite possibility, like the quantum field, and perceiving
Right.
everything through a higher perspective and exploring the mental aspects, exploring the emotional aspects, exploring the different dimensions from where our experience of life originates, from where we are creating what is being reflected to us. And there are just so many different layers to it. So we're brought to the layer that feels most relevant to bring light to. Akashic Perspective is helping us shine the light of our consciousness, of our awareness, on parts of us that we're presently unconscious to.
So then Akasha or Akashic would be like the highest, almost the highest, I guess the highest level that embodies all that is within it.
Akasha is a Sanskrit word for ethers or space.
Okay.
It's an element. That's Akasha. And it is the element that is believed to be the primordial element. It's the element that existed before all other elements, and it's the element that gave rise to all elements. So it's what existed first and what holds everything. And Akasha is the only element that's infinite. It's unlimited. Meanwhile, all the other elements are limited. They're finite. Yeah. And I'm about coming to the end, just so you know.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I was just getting like a little, it's funny you say that because I was just getting like a little poke in my head that you should wrap it up. Is I think that's what you meant by the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess if we're both getting that signal at the same time, let's wrap it up then. So Daniela, thank you. I appreciate you being here. I'm going to grab all your links from you and drop them in the show notes below. So I'd love to give you the floor if you have anything that you want to give to the audience, tell them any words of encouragement, feel free to plug yourself as well. Whatever you're feeling, the floor is yours.
Ooh. I love you guys. Thank you so much for being here and for tuning in. I appreciate your presence. And I would love to share more with you if you feel inspired to connect on Instagram or on Facebook or via YouTube. You're also welcome to check out my website. Occasionally I open up my calendar to one-on-one Akashic sessions with the public. So you're always welcome to check that if you'd like to receive a one-on-one Akashic transmission. And if you feel inspired to learn how to access the Akashic Records yourself, know that it is a practice that is available to everybody, to absolutely everybody. And the prerequisites are to be able to create spaciousness in your mind so that you can receive insight, so that you can serve as a channel, as well as trust and having pure intentions. And through that, we all have the innate potential and possibility to access a higher perspective. And it's probably not nearly as complicated as you may be believing it is. It also is not necessarily a special gift destined for only a few. It does require some spiritual maturity. We do have to be able to not be so identified with or attached to our perspective and our beliefs, because that is going to stunt our ability to rise above our perspective and our beliefs, which is what we are doing when we access Akashic Perspective. So sharing this with you so that if you feel the call, you can begin to cultivate your own practice. It is such a life-changing practice. Not only are we seeing ourselves and our lives through a higher perspective, we're also channeling this very healing, divine energy that helps us feel so much love and trust and possibility. It also empowers us. It's a perspective that continuously aligns us with the perspective of spirit and helps us transcend some of the limitations, the limiting beliefs that we hold, or the collective beliefs that create contraction or create fear, create mistrust, so that we can really live well and live from this place of love and live from this place of possibility and live from this place of trust, which changes everything. So that is always available to you. I'd love to encourage you to begin to develop your own practice. There are so many ways to cultivate your own practice. One of those infinite number of ways is through my Akashic Metamorphosis training, which I would love to invite you to. It is an online practitioner training where you are initiated into Akashic practice, and you will learn how to read the Akashic Records both for yourself and for others. And also
Beautiful.
learn a lot about becoming an Akashic practitioner, like all the spiritual business aspects of it.
Right, because everything has its own energy, whether it's your business or you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And and the thing I'll end your statement on is like, if one person can do it, everybody can, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think it's Christ that said some sort of quote like, everything that I do, you can do even more greatly, something along those lines.
It's
like
beautiful.
all the miracles that I have performed, you can perform and even more so. Some sort of quote like that. Don't remember it at all, but something like that.
Well, and that, I mean, not to drag this out, but to me, like, you know, the whole thing with him walking on water, curing people of being blind, like, you know, for a long time, I kind of thought like, oh, that's probably kind of made up. But even tying into what I was talking about earlier, I'm getting to a point where I believe that those things probably actually happen. Like it would take a lot of people to make that stuff up, to be like, oh, we're just kind of making this up to make a religion. Like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that's possible, but until I walk on water, I'll get back to you in a few years, and then I'll be walking on water, and we'll reconvene then. But Daniela, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Guys, check out all of her links below. Absolutely beautiful person. Grateful you took the time out of your day to chat and share your message. It's a powerful one. With that being said, guys, a lot of big things coming. Not sure when everything's getting rolled out, but you know, got a lot of transformation stuff happening, as we talked about with the Akashic Records. I'm not going to drag it on too long. I appreciate you guys being here. Check out all Daniela's links below. And with that being said, let's keep growing together.